no, I don't have favourite huts. There's too much variety and too many good places out there for that. They're a wonderful equaliser and bringing together of people socially and culturally. They can do for a community what camping will never do.
Kia ora, and welcome to The Tramping Life, a podcast about hiking in Aotearoa, New Zealand, or as we call it here, tramping. I'm John T, and in each episode I chat with people who share a passion for exploring this incredible country. We'll hear about the tracks they love, the huts they return to, the lessons they've learned, and what keeps them heading back into the bush. My guest today is Rob Brown, one of the most influential voices in New Zealand tramping. Rob is the manager of the Backcountry Trust, the organisation that supports volunteers to restore and maintain our huts and tracks. He's also well known as a photographer, writer, and a long-time advocate for the outdoors, and I'm delighted to welcome him to the podcast. Can you give us a bit of a flavour about where you grew up and what some of your earliest memories are being outdoors?
Yeah, so I grew up on a farm in the Waikato. It was a little bit of a insular upbringing in some ways, although I enjoyed growing up on a farm. It was really nice. And when I was 14, I went off to a thing called the Tihoi Venture School, which is down near the Waikato, which was part of a boarding school I was going to at the time. I won't say I necessarily got into the outdoors through that, though. It was run a little bit like the army in those days. We're talking early 1980s. And in many ways, it possibly put me off for a while. But I did learn a lot about survival skills, street smart. It was run in a bit of a chaotic way, and I learned to have a bit of an eye for when silly things were happening, I suppose.
Where would the activities take place? Is there a national park near them or a reserve?
We had Puriora Forest Park right on our back doorstep, and
Beautiful.
There was various other activities like kayaking and sailing and all sorts of various things. We used to go down to Tongariro, Ngarahoe and Ruapehu occasionally. Didn't get onto Ruapehu so much. Yeah, so that was all when I was 14 years old. And we had 6 months there, and that was kind of like school for 6 months. Then went back to my hometown, and it wasn't until I went to university at the Massey University in the late 1980s that I really got into tramping in the outdoors. And I got lucky then because I just happened to arrive there when it was a particularly vibrant time for the Massey University Alpine Club. It was just one of those really, really good university outdoors clubs. You know, we were students in those days who worked pretty hard during the week but made sure we had our weekends free. And so every weekend the club had a hut up on the southern slopes of Turoa. And so we used to go up there most weekends, and through that we got into skiing and climbing quite a lot. And I guess it was there I suddenly learnt that tramping was actually supposed to be fun, which was quite a contrast to what my experience had been when I was 14 years old. So by this stage I was early 20s. I was quite a late student going there because I'd worked in engineering straight out of school and gone there to do a technology degree. Yeah, so I had 3 very happy years at Massey University Alpine Club, and that's where I met Shaun, great adventure buddy, and someone who I got into photography with and writing with, and that was a long and happy partnership that all started there. So we had some other people that were really influential at that time. A really good mate, Tim Kerr, who was just a machine in the hills and dragged me up a few climbs that I had no right to be on. You know, so people like that were there.
Do you remember any specific kind of moments or tramp you did whilst at university that really made you think, yeah, this is what I like doing?
Tramping-wise, perhaps not so much. I wasn't doing the big, longer tramps in those days. I was doing quite a lot of alpine climbing. Climbed Cook in my last sort of summer at university, various other climbs. We did a little bit of Nelson Lakes, but there was a lot of it was focused on walking in somewhere and going and climbing a mountain. It wasn't until I left university that I got into more multi-day tramping and transalpine tramping. And again, that was really, Shaun was the sort of big instigator of that. In those days, I'd probably done more climbing. But Shaun was based in the North Island working for Doc. We came out of university in the mother of all budgets when there was like 10 or 11% unemployment in New Zealand, and the economy was a train wreck for several years, and not so different to how things are heading now. So it was a really hard time to come out of university. There was a lot of us who had a lot of skills, thought we had a lot to offer, but none of us were getting jobs. Shaun started doing voluntary work for Doc, and I started working off in the repairs department at Macpac, but we couldn't actually get jobs in what we were trained to do. So again, yeah, it was a prompter to get into doing some other things. And I think the photography and making a little bit of money on the side doing that sort of came out of a bit of that desperation in some ways. Shaun was the instigator of these big long trips, so he would, once he got a full-time job up in the North Island with Doc after he finished his voluntary stuff, he would send me down these plans and schemes, and he would have researched it all, and I would go, yep, sounds good to me. Looks like a neat place to go. And we'd generally make those sort of a week or 10 days. They were into places like the Landsborough Wilderness area, or we did a really neat trip, I remember once, up over Whitcomb Pass and over the Lang Range into Ivory Lake, and then out via the Waidaha. And those were the days when there was hardly anyone going into those places.
No, it wasn't on the list of the best huts in the world at that time. It was very much a bit of a secret. Lee Sanson was saying there was a boat that used to be on Ivory Lake you go out into, or was that there when you were?
I don't remember the boat, but I very much remember walking into those huts and them being like still museum pieces. Price's Basin hut, I remember we walked into that and it still had all the old cans of food from the deer colours on the shelves in the cupboard, and still the old kerosene cooker and all those sorts of things. And Ivory Lake, yeah, it was very much like the glaciologists had left yesterday. So, yeah, it was a neat time. Ivory Lake, of course, the glacier was still flowing into that lake in those days, and in 30 years' time, that glacier virtually doesn't exist anymore.
And the tracks at that time, there was still the remnants from the Forest Service in terms of being well maintained, or were things starting to, with the dock and the budget, were things starting to slip? Or
yeah, they were definitely slipping and going downhill. And I think it's a bit of a myth that they were handed over to Dock in good condition from the Forest Service. They were on their way downhill even then on the West Coast. I mean, when I look back at it now, the huts were 30 years old at the time, so they hadn't had a lot of maintenance, and they were rustic, but we didn't think that they were in decline or unsavable. But when I look at the hut network now, I think it's looking better than ever. So those buildings have proved to be very resilient through periods of non-maintenance, and they're not difficult buildings to fix up. The tracks, as I remember, were pretty rough. Yeah, it was definitely a bit of thrashing and route finding, trying to find markers in places, especially on the West Coast.
Do you remember any specific tramps that really pushed you to your limit? You thought, this is about all I've got to give?
I definitely remember Shaun and I getting absolutely sandbagged going up the Otoko River into the Landsborough Wilderness area. We knew our friend Tim Kerr had been there just the year before and had gone up the Otoko, and he'd told us that it was 2 relatively straightforward days to the head of the Otoko. And we just had an epic in there. We struggled to find the deer trails that were easy to find on the side of that river. Found some of the going pretty hard. It's all untracked, big, wild West Coast river. Amazing. The feeling of wildness in that place. I vividly remember seeing a combined flock of kea and kaka, which I'd never seen before and have never seen since. And it's got all these big sort of steep walls on the northern side of Mount Hooker, and very, very impressive place. But it took us 3 days of hard going to get to the head of the Otoko River. And by the time we got into Mark's Flat, I remember we were both feeling pretty shell-shocked. We didn't end up climbing Mount Hooker, unfortunately, because Shaun had to be out and we'd felt like we'd lost a day. And so we gave up a very nice day's climbing to continue on the journey out. And then when we got out, we sort of rang up Tim and sort of said, how did you make it up there in 2 days? And he said, did I say 2? I meant 3. And with Tim's mischievous way, I think he knew that we'd probably had pretty similar experience to him. Yeah. But all of those trips were highly memorable. We did a really nice trip through the Dragon's Teeth at one stage, I remember. We went the wrong way to do the high route. We were trying to do the high route, but hadn't really thought that one through and started off trying to go down the high route until quickly realised that this wasn't the way you were supposed to go.
Is it as gnarly as the photos would suggest?
Well, we probably didn't do enough of it to get a good handle on it, but yeah, you're definitely supposed to go the other way. You're not supposed to go down it. No, that's sort of asking for trouble. So,
are there any times you got particularly close to disaster?
No, I think both of us had reasonably good survival instincts and not wanting to put ourselves in any sort of risk. There was one I wrote up when we did that trip over into Ivory Lake. We went along the direct ridge, climbed up onto a ridge, and then headed straight towards a ridge on going over the Lang Range. And I remember there was this huge big boulder sitting in kind of shaly sort of dirt stuff that we had to get round. And I went round the side of this thing, and just as I was getting onto the top of it, it felt really horrible and unstable. And just as I was getting onto the top of it, the whole boulder just peeled off the ridge and went down. But as that happened, I'd sort of scampered up and then round onto the safe ground really quickly because out of, a surge of adrenaline. And Shaun couldn't see me. So he was sitting below waiting for his turn to go round this bloody great boulder. And all he thought was that I'd gone with it. And so it wasn't until he heard me yelling from the top of the thing, you can come up, but, go the other way because it'll be a bit safer. So that was probably one near miss. I remember on the trip we did into the Hook of Landsborough as well, we had there was a couple of bits of that where one day going across McCullough Pass, I nearly took a horrible tumble. Luckily I stopped after about tumbling down 3 or 4 somersaults, but that was just trying to cut across some steep ground when I was tired at the end of the day, and just that usual situation where making the wrong choice because you've had a long, hard day. I remember the only time I saw Shaun having a close run was we were coming down the Waidaha, and there was a notorious slip there just before we get to Kiwi Hut. There was a cable across it at one stage, and that cable had been washed out by more slip activity. And I remember Shaun had just woken up that night and eaten something bad, and he'd been throwing up, and he'd felt pretty miserable the whole day, but he was stoically going on. I think the slip's about an hour and a bit from Kiwi Flat Hut, and sort of edged across it. I went across it first, and then you had to do this scramble up onto the eroded bit where you could regain the track. And I did that first, and I was sitting there watching Shaun come across, seeing he was quite exhausted. He got almost to the end of it, and he took a tumble and went down. I thought he was going to go all the way to the river, but he hauled himself up quite quickly. And again, the surge of adrenaline, he sort of scrambled up and then got himself back up onto the track, and he just sat down looking... I've never seen Shaun looking like that tramping before, and he looked totally washed out. Anyway, he was sitting there. He had a hole in his long johns while we were trying to have something to eat, just to recharge the batteries again. A wasp went into his long johns up into his thigh and stung him about 5 times before he could get it out. And he was just sitting there thinking, shit, what else has to happen today? Let's get to the next hut. Yeah, those sort of days, they become memorable and they stick in your mind.
It's the hard days of the memorable. At the time, they're a shocker, but afterwards they really stick in the memory. So were there most of those hikes you do just yourself and Shaun, or did you do much solo tramping or with bigger groups?
That sort of time in the 1990s, up till we published Classic Tramping, that's when most of those trips were happening. And then Shaun went overseas with his wife Tanya, and he was overseas for about a year travelling around. And by that stage, I'd finished at MacPac and I was working for Potton and Burton Publishing. And Craig had already published the book on the Great Walks, and I had this idea that we would do a companion volume called Classic Tramping. And so Shaun was out of the country. I was off on a trip with Robbie Burton, who was the publisher, and Robbie just jumped at this idea, and I said to him, and Shaun and I should co-write it. And so anyway, I sort of committed Shaun to this big project without really asking him, and then wrote him a sort of slightly apologetic letter saying, by the way, when you get back, we've got this project to do. But luckily he was sort of thinking, what was his next step? And I think he was keen to finish up at Doc and go out on his own. He wasn't keen to go back to Doc. He was keen to go out and make a career out of writing and publishing. So, yes, he sort of came back and suddenly it had all fallen into his lap that he had a nice book project sitting in front of him. And we had a wonderful summer, that summer of 98 and part of 1999, putting that book together. So we did a really intensive sort of year and a bit, doing all the tracks again, most of them together, but sometimes with other friends, just to try and get through all the work before we could meet all the publishers' deadlines.
Those are relatively early days in terms of, obviously there's Muse Guide and there's been tramping books forever, but in terms of the more larger appeal, I guess the photography, maybe that's when they kind of start taking off from there?
Yeah, well, certainly that book did a lot better than the publisher was expecting. And I think in those days we still saw tramping books. There'd been a few from people like Jeff Spearpoint and Mark Pickering, but they were still selling in relatively small numbers and still seen as relatively fringe. Mark had done pretty well out of his big overall tramping guides, but anything that was a bit more coffee table-ish had sort of been a bit harder to get across the line. But sort of got the timing right then, and and of course for Shaun, I mean, I went off on the photography sort of way, and was wanting to start my own sort of publishing thing with greeting cards and that sort of thing. But Shaun very much wanted to push his writing and basically becoming Mr. Tramping in New Zealand. He had exactly the right background for that. He'd started a lot earlier than me and could write really well about those sort of things. My writing tends to go in fits and starts, and I get inspired by all sorts of different things. But he always had a very, very, very tight focus and was an incessant collector of all sorts of little scraps of information wherever he could get it. He had a huge archive of sort of stuff that he'd built up over the years.
Back in those days, it was very early days on the internet. There's not so much around. Like these days, there's almost too much information, and you've got the Instagram, you've got a doc website. There's so many different sources for information, and so I guess in those days you were having to develop it yourselves.
Oh yeah, it was definitely a different world, and we're all shooting on film as well. I look at what's being produced these days with people able to, the level of creativity you can expand into with how much digital photography is opened up to. I mean, good and bad. I mean, some people definitely abuse that, but when it's done really well, I can look back at the photography from those days and I'm pretty happy with it. But then I also look at it and think, if only I had all those tools now, that are around, could have done quite a lot more.
Equipment malfunctions. I'm just thinking about carrying rolls of film and keeping them dry.
No, not really. No, we had all that stuff pretty well thought through. The nice thing is there was always a very friendly competitiveness between us on the photography front. It pushed us to do better. There would always be times we'd get back out and someone would have seen something that the other person didn't see, and you think, bugger, where'd you see that?
In terms of equipment, I guess, on the theme of cameras, have you got any favourite bits of gear?
Well, in those days, I was shooting large format film, so I had these horrendously heavy packs at times, and I would carry in 50 sheets of basically 4x5 film. So I would have two cameras with me. Shaun would have one camera, and I usually have a smaller, lighter 35mm camera and a large format 4x5 camera and a tripod. So I'd only have 50 sheets, so I'd have to be pretty careful about what I was photographing. And so, my job was to try and get the really big forest interiors or the big scenic or whatever and shoot those sort of things. And it was back-breaking work.
For a 7 to 10 day trip with all the food plus the camera gear plus the terrain, that's quite an adventure.
Yeah, be about 35 kgs start off with most trips, so it was quite a lot.
So on the food side of things, were you and Shaun kind of foodies, or you just needed the fuel to get you through?
We couldn't afford to go and buy freeze-dry, so we just used to cook pretty simple, plenty of pasta and rice. After we'd published Classic Tramping, to celebrate, I'd been doing quite a few trips to Stewart Island because I was on to my next book project, and Shaun, I don't think had done much on Stewart Island, so we flew down to Doughboy Bay, landed on the beach. I remember there was a little sort of biv that was pretty grotty in those days down at Doughboy Bay, a little Forest Service biv, and that sort of supplemented the accommodation in the caves. So we landed there, and we had food for 10 days, and we're going to walk up the Western Beaches and then fly out of West Ruggedy. We're going to spend a couple of nights at Doughboy Bay, so we had our packs full, but also some shopping bags of food, and we went in and we just dumped these on the table in this makeshift shelter that was on the front of this biv, and then went off for a walk on the beach and go and take some photographs, and we were away for about an hour. Came back, and I think 2 of the loaves of bread that we had there had been half eaten by rats. Straight into it. Oh, okay. It's going to be a bit of a hungry trip.
So your rations for the rest of the...
Yeah. So I'm very much hoping that big zip program that's going down there is killing as many rats and possums as it can right now.
How was the wildlife in Rakiura from when you first went? I don't know when you last visited, but have you seen much of a difference over time?
Stewart Island doesn't have stoats, but it's still got some major problems, and you probably see more bird life around the village now. It's just that really, really strong community trapping program that's going there. You see more kaka there, and I think part of that's food supply, but a lot of it is that the community's been pretty good about trapping. But I think the cats are a major problem. The rats are a major problem. The bird life's okay, but it's not nearly as good as what it should be. I've spent some time over on Codfish Island, and that's what all of Stewart Island should look like. You go to Ulver Island and you think, oh, this is fantastic. It's what all of Stewart Island should be like.
The tramping with Shaun, how long did that continue for? Did you guys go separate ways a little bit? Life gets in the way, or you kept tramping together?
Both of us had families, and then Shaun was off pursuing a writing career, and I was going in a more photography side of things. We did have a really, really neat trip that we did through the Southern Alps with Elise Bryant. That was just an amazing trip, actually, over a month. Started at Mount Cook the day after Christmas in 2000. We'd had a heavy snowfall, and so it almost felt like not summer conditions, but late winter, early spring conditions. But we started off anyway and caught a water taxi up the new Lake Tasman at that stage and went into the Murchison. So our idea was to go up through to Arthur's Pass, through as much difficult country as we could. So crisscrossing back and forth the main divide.
I assume you had some friends who did resupply.
We had two major food dumps, and we had one at St Winifred's Hut up the Havelock. I think we did 10 days to get to that point, and then went through over the gardens into the Whanganui, and we had three friends flying in with the food drop. And we get in there and welcome to all this fresh buns and pate that had really been turned on. It was Shaun's friend Tony Gates, who's no longer with us. And Tony was a really, really good mate of Shaun's and a little bit eccentric on some of that sort of stuff. And he said, oh, there's heaps of food, help yourself. Well, we're off today to go up and explore this area. So they went off for the day. And we start looking through the hut to try and find Shaun's carefully prepared food drop. And there's bits and pieces and boxes, and we're thinking, oh, the food must be out in a meat safe or somewhere. So we spent the morning looking around in the forest for some mythical meat safe with this food drop. Nothing there. And eventually it dawns on us that the food in the hut is the food for the six of us for the next 10 days. And there's not a lot of it. And Tony arrives back and proudly announces to Shaun that he thought he'd packed far too much and had pruned a few things out and reorganised everything. And Shaun was just seething, but Shaun was just incredibly polite about it all. The redeeming thing was that Tony was also a hunter and had a rifle, and the following day went and banged over a tar for us. So we ended up having a lot of chewy tar curry for the next few days. So we all survived and it all worked out.
On the question of huts, your specialist subject, do you have favourite huts, or are they a bit like children? It's hard to pick between them?
No, I don't have favourite huts. There's too much variety and too many good places out there for that. I think they just serve this wonderful sort of social, cultural thing in New Zealand where, well, for me, it's not only the basic sort of shelter of them and that whole feeling of arriving in a storm and the protection they give you, it's also all the times you've met various people and places, and they're a wonderful equaliser and bringing together of people, and every little one can feel like a little communal marae in some ways. I love that sort of aspect of them. Socially and culturally, they can do for a community what camping will never do. And I like the way that buildings can do that, especially very simple ones like that. It doesn't matter what your background is and wherever you come from, you're in this one place for the night. There's a fire on and people having to socialise and talk, and especially in the digital age with so much being done online, and there's so many sort of ways of separating people with those real kind of interactions. I think they've become more important than ever, for me anyway.
You turned it into your job, your kind of career now with the Backcountry Trust. I mean, how did that come about?
I think some people have been quite negative at times that we were simply taking over a job that DOC should have been doing, the government should have been doing. I'm not sure for the last 40 years that we've ever been paying the sort of taxes or been a wealthy enough country for the government to have been able to do all those things. That's just a simple reality, and I think we've had to get past that sense of entitlement that everyone's expected these things. And we do have a wonderful hut network there, but I think it was not really realistic to think that the government was just going to keep funding that forever and a day. And we've got far more pressing needs: health, education, biodiversity issues. All of them cost a lot of money. And then when I look at the models that happen overseas, Iceland's a place that I've done quite a lot of time in the last 10 years, and they've got more huts per head of population than we have in New Zealand. They've got slightly lower servicing costs because most of them are accessible by four-wheel drive, but most of them, in fact, probably 95% of them, are run by local community groups, and somehow they make it work. But they do charge European-type prices to go there, but they're beautifully maintained.
Iceland's got a far higher number of tourists per capita than we do. Well, we have a lot of tourists, but Iceland is overwhelmed, and it's a very short season in the summer, so there's a lot of people in a short period of time.
You're absolutely right. And I think the first time I went there, we didn't have to book huts, and we'd just go into the high country and turn up at huts, and there'd be a warden, and you'd pay your money, and that was it. The last time I did a trip there was 2023, and most of it I had to book nearly a year in advance, in the same way you do European-type huts. And I agree. I think Iceland's an interesting case study of unrestrained tourism, and I think there's definitely lessons in it for us. Yeah, for sure. Where's it going in New Zealand? I'm very keen to see us still have an integrated, publicly owned hut network that still sits under the DOC label. I don't want to see it fragmented into a whole lot of mini groups here and there. I don't think that's helpful for us as a country. A lot of our success is also built from having really good, strong relationships with regional DOC staff. To keep attracting quality people, there needs to be engaging, interesting work that they're committed to. And so if you start trying to lop off parts of that and just put it out to another organisation, that's not going to be helpful long term. So the secret of our success has been a partnership model, not a sort of come in and take over, and I just don't see a long-term benefit in that. And when I look at all the work that we've done over the years, the stuff I'm the most proud of is where it's got DOC, the community, ourselves as almost like a facilitator and a mover and shaker to make that happen, bringing all those components together, and everyone comes away feeling really good about it and feeling really satisfied they've put something back into a place they love. Because most of the DOC staff I deal with in the regions, they all love these places too. They live in the community, they go and recreate there, they go hunting or take their kids tramping there, and it's really important they got that sense of ownership there too.
Do you think the current model of the Backcountry Trust and perhaps the level of funding it receives is sustainable going forward?
Well, I think definitely funding sustainability is a hot topic at the moment. We've got a short breathing space with the current incoming visitor levy funding, and I think it's appropriate that the incoming visitor levy contributes a little bit to what we're doing, as well as obviously a lot to some of DOC's core work. I mean, the tourists have discovered our remote hut network, there's no doubt about that, and that'll continue to happen, and there will continue to be growing use there. But the other thing is the user contribution side of things. I mean, sadly, it's been tagged as a user pays thing. Well, it's not really. All we're actually asking for is a contribution, and if we think that's kept pretty modestly, and we can get people to a place where they're comfortable doing self-compliance rather than us having wardens and various people running around the hills trying to make sure people have paid hut fees, but actually people are paying it because they can see what they're getting for their money, basically.
And there's an increasing number of huts that are going onto the hut booking system, which there's pros and cons, but one of the pros is they've paid. You have to pay to book the hut.
I think booking systems you've still got to be careful with, but I think there's definitely a place for them, and I just think you've got to use it wisely. One of the things that we just built a new hut up at Brass Monkey, and we only put 4 of the 6 bunks on the booking system there. And I think that's just to provide for an opportunity. You might get people walking in who don't feel like they're up to carrying a tent and a heavy load or anything, and they want the security to book, and they're happy to do it in advance. And then other people that just want the freedom of the hills type thing and to turn up, and they're happy to carry a tent. If they turn up and the hut's full, they're camping. But if there's a bunk spare, they'll grab it. and that's all good too. So I just think we've got to look at what's appropriate for the place and be careful about how we do that. I certainly think the idea of free huts is coming to an end. We've had 300 of the huts sitting there on that basic free category, and our view of maintaining them is to do the work really well, and we've been holding them all at a level as a preserve in perpetuity type approach, and New Zealanders seem to want that because we get a lot of support for it. But there will come a point where there needs to be a user contribution to that. And how do we do that? I don't think it's possibly best for a government department to be asking for that money if they're not doing the work on those huts. So I think we've got some discussions to happen there about what a formula might look at. The important thing everyone needs to focus on is what outcome do we want? And I think I see quite a lot of general agreement that everyone wants these little places retained and looked after. They're part of New Zealand's identity. People get a lot of enjoyment out of them. They're a huge contributor to people living healthy, happy lifestyles in New Zealand. When I look at how New Zealand society's changed, when I was growing up, most young guys were out playing rugby on the weekends, and rugby isn't even in the top 40 participation sports anymore. And you look at where a lot of those young guys in their early 20s, early 30s are, and they're out hunting and fishing on the weekend, and they're not necessarily doing the team sports anymore. So we've had quite a societal change, and that's definitely contributed to the big boom in the outdoors. You just have to look at how big the hunting and fishing shops are in most of the cities around New Zealand to know that it's a huge part of how people are recreating. Tramping is static. I know club membership, but there's a lot of people that are getting into tramping in different ways. So many more people taking their young kids tramping, which I think's wonderful. And I used to see the odd sort of hardy person doing it 15, 20 years ago. There's been some really good provision for creating opportunities that it's easy to take your kids. And that's where things like the booking system work really well, I think. Because having done it with all three of my kids, I can tell you turning up at a hut, not finding any bunks when you've been the slowest people to the hut because you've got two young kids is not much fun. You definitely want to know that there's a bunk for you there.
Do you have any thoughts on Te Araroa and the sustainability and how that's managed and how much load that's putting on the hut network? The route was taking in some huts which didn't used to get a lot of visitation, and now they're overwhelmed.
Overall, I think Te Araroa is a good thing, and we certainly have a close working relationship with Te Araroa Trust and will continue to do so. I myself know quite a few New Zealanders that have walked Te Araroa, and it's been a life-changing thing for them. I know fathers and daughters that have walked them, or I've got a good friend whose daughter walked a couple of summers ago, and it was a big life-changing thing. So anything like that in the outdoors I tend to view as a really positive, good thing. I think the Te Araroa Trust are only just catching up now, but there was perhaps quite an influx of people who came in from overseas who just saw it as a cheap, easy, long trail to do. They've recognised that and they've turned it round. It's taken a while to get the trail pass up and running. It benefits a lot of communities that the trail goes through. There's a couple of hot spots where I think there's some issues to sort out. Obviously, Blue Lake is one of them, going through Nelson Lakes. I think that's probably going to be a costly problem to get on top of in terms of thinking about what alternative accommodation might look like there. I wouldn't like to see the old hut go near the lake. My favoured option there is to still have a ranger presence that's mainly based at that hut, and that you might have 8 bunks that can be booked for people going over Moss Pass, just for people that can do other trips. And then there's another site where you could put a bigger hut away from the lake. I think you definitely got to get camping and people milling about that lake away from it. I don't think you're going to change the desire to go through that part of the country on the trail. I've looked at some other routes there, but I think such a beautiful area that people are going to want to go there. It's just how you manage that. I think most of the other ones, I think Te Araroa are pretty onto it, and I think where the difficulty is going to come is that I think the numbers are sort of maxing out now. The ability to grow numbers on the trail, I think, it's going to be difficult. I think what are the other changes we'll see? I can see more huts on the main trail going on the booking system, for the simple reason is that walkers tend to book that sort of thing a week in advance. So if you're a local club who wants to go and do a walk in, say, Richmond Forest Park, and you're planning that out in your club schedule, you'll be able to just go and book that 3 or 4 months in advance. So I see the booking system as a way that can stop New Zealanders being shut out of those places.
From a publishing perspective, it seems to be a bit of a bright spot. I think I've read myself 4 or 5 books on the TA. It feels like almost everybody who's done the TA has written a book about it. It's quite a popular subject for authors. I mean, it tells a good story. And it's interesting the different ways different people have approached telling that story.
Yeah, and I must go and read a few more of them. I do have some friends that have read some of the recent ones that have come out and said they're very good. But everyone's got a similar story. They've had something that's been a very powerful thing in their life. And I think the interesting thing about the outdoors community, people who want everyone to embrace nature, is that we all want people to go and enjoy these places and have more nature in their lives. If that's the case, you can't complain when you see a lot of people out there doing it. You've just got to think, how do we do this? New Zealand's got a lot of wild places. I'm still a big advocate for trying to spread people out a little bit more. I think if I've got one criticism of how we've conducted some of our policy, we tend to measure bed nights and then keep pouring money into certain places based on bed nights. And sadly, I think the best way to keep connecting people with nature and catering for the obvious demand, which is significant, is to have a bit more of a balanced investment policy where you're trying to spread the load out and look for some other opportunities. We're certainly trying to do that at BCT. When we look at putting Anti-Crow onto the booking system recently, the number of fantastic comments we got coming through from, in particular, people with young families who are looking for that sort of experience close to Christchurch, and then thinking, yes, we've got things like Woolshed Creek, but that often gets booked out, and then there's this other hut and that often gets booked out. So we're now starting to think we do need to be looking at not retrenching the number of opportunities, but actually looking where some of the new opportunities should be.
The population's growing. The demand will keep increasing for the backcountry and for the other trends you've talked about. We've either got to try and keep up with it, or you end up in these challenging situations that the TA had or Iceland have where demand exceeds supply, and then that's not a very good situation for anybody, really.
That's right. I think we can do it and retain what's really special about the really remote wild sort of places. I can think of a few places in Fiordland where you could open up some really good overnight tramping opportunities, and it wouldn't change anything at all about Fiordland. There's a lot of wild country out there.
Do you have any left on your bucket list, or you've seen a fair bit of the country now?
Oh, no, plenty of places I want to go. I was just talking to a friend the other day. I still haven't really done a good long tramp in Richmond Forest Park. I just went to the Carwickers for the first time the other day, and Shaun had been trying to get me there for years, and I feel really bad. Got there to do a trip with him before he passed away. I totally opened my eyes to seeing why he got into tramping so early and why he was so passionate about it. I loved the Carwick, so I really want to go back and do another couple of trips there. It's a whole lifetime of tramping still to go, for sure. Plus places I want to go and visit again. I mean, I've gone and walked the Milford Track 4 times now, and last time was with my family, but I'd go and do it again tomorrow if I got the opportunity. I got mainly known from the harder trips I did when I was doing a lot of tramping. But the reality is, for most people, is we go through a life cycle of tramping, and that the reason we have a range of opportunities is partly to cater for a range of people, but also it partly caters for people during their life cycle as well. You need your family trips for when you've got a family. You need your easy tramps when you're beginning and getting towards the end of your tramping days.
Well, that's a really good point to end our conversation on. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks, Jonty. It's been nice to do a little trip down memory lane. I don't often get to do that. I tend to live thinking about what's going to happen next, so I don't actually think about what's been in the past too much. So it's a really neat opportunity to have.
Thank you so much for listening to The Tramping Life. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please follow the podcast in whatever app you use. Tell a friend about it and consider leaving a rating or a review. It really helps more people discover the show. If you have any questions or feedback, I'd love to hear from you. Drop me an email at thetrampinglife, one word, @gmail.com.